So in our last lesson, we looked at different types of loops, and we traversed some strings using loops. In this lesson, we're going to look at nested loops. So let's start by making a row of stars. So we'll say for int row starting at 1, and we're going to go while row is less than or equal to 3. And then we'll increment row. And then in the body of our loop, we're going to just system.out.print, and let's print a star. Okay, so when we execute this code, we have a single loop. Here's our output. Right, we've got 3 stars. Right, our outside loop here has a starting value of 1. Then we go through its 2, 3, and then it stops. Now, if I wanted, instead of a single row, I wanted rows and columns of stars. Okay, then what we're going to do is something called a nested loop. So inside of our for loop that has the rows, we're going to make another loop that will contain the columns. So again, we'll start at 1, and let's go until we have 5 columns, and we'll increment our columns. Okay, so this is going to print a column, and then we're going to need, before we go to the next, or to the outside for loop, we're going to need to go to the next line. So we'll do system.out.println, and that'll skip us down to the next line. So let's go ahead and compile and take a look at what that gives us. So here we've got 5 columns, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we've got 3 rows on our outside. Okay. If I wanted to change this up a little bit, I think I'm going to put a space in here to just clean it up a little. And let's start, or this time let's switch it around. Let's have 5 rows, and we'll have 3 columns, so we can see the difference there. So let's compile and run. Right, and now there's our 3 columns and our 5 rows. Okay, so I think the columns and rows is the easiest way to show how a nested loop works. Right, it's going to print out the star for our columns, then it's going to come back and fill them in for each of these rows. Now let's take a look at an application for using nested loops. So I get back up here again. There we go. Oh boy, it just wants to jump around. Put my bracket back in there. There we go. Okay, so in this application, we're going to print out the factorials of all numbers between 2 inputs. So let's go ahead and start by creating a scanner so we can gather some user input. So scanner keyboard equals new scanner, system.in, and we're going to call the values that we get from the scanner first, keyboard.nextInt, and last. And those inputs, we're going to prompt the user to give us some specific data. So we'll say system.out.println, or no, just print. And we want the user to enter an integer. And then after they enter an integer, actually we should say a positive integer, because we don't can't take the factorial of a negative number. So once we get that one, then we'll say enter a larger positive integer. Okay, so now we have two integers as inputs that we can use to find the factorials. So our outer loop is going to need to loop from that positive, first positive integer to the last positive integer, going one at a time. So we're going to say for int num equals first, that's our first integer. We're going to keep going while num is less than or equal to the last integer, and then we'll increment the num. So that's going to loop us through each one of the integers between the input values from the user. Okay, now let's go ahead and find the factorial. So we'll say that int factorial starts at 1, and now we're going to loop down through our numbers. So int I, we're going to start at 1. We're going to keep going until the I is less than or equal to the number from our outer loop, and we're going to increment the I. And each time we're going to make factorial equal to the product of its previous value times I. So say our I starts at 1 and our number is 3, right? The first time that we go through, factorial is 1 times 1. The next time it's 1 times 2. The next time it's that 2 times 3. Right? We're going to get all of those digits multiplied together to find its factorial. So now we're ready to print that factorial that we've calculated. So we'll say system.out.println num, and then we'll concatenate the notation for factorial, which is an exclamation point, and then an equals, and we'll concatenate that with the value of the actual factorial that we found. Okay, then we close the braces on our for loop. So here's our inner loop, here's our outer loop, then this one closes the main method, and this one closes the class. Okay, so let's see, we'll go ahead and compile, see if we need to do any debugging. Okay, that looks good. That's a first, and then we'll go ahead and run. Okay, so we're going to start with a positive integer. Let's try 5, larger integer 9, and there's our factorials, right? 5 factorial is 120 on up through 9. Now, factorials get really big really fast, so an integer might not actually be the best storage for our factorial if you want to do larger values. So we could change this to a long instead. So we'd have a 1L for our starting value, and then that would allow us to process much larger factorials. Okay, so for example, if we went from 10 factorial to 30 factorial, right now we can see that these numbers are super, super big. So if we come over here, right, there's 19, 20, I think at 21, now we're starting to get some overflow error, right? See how these are becoming negative? So even changing from an int to a long, because the factorials get so big so fast, we really can't go beyond 20 without having some overflow. But 20 is pretty far, right? Let's put that back to an int and see how far we could get calculating factorials before we run into overflow errors. So we'll start with 10 again and go to 20. And oh, there you can see they come in much faster, right? We made it to 16 factorial, but at 17 factorial, there we've got a negative. So that encountered an overflow error. Okay, so the long gives us a little bit more that we can work with. We made it all the way up to 20 using long instead of an int.